Peter Jones is Director of Engineering at Palm Cloud, and he has been working on the Lustre project for 13 years, right?
Yeah. Okay, hi. Hey everyone. So, all right, is that about the right volume? Okay. So I'm talking to you today in my capacity as one of the leads of the OpenSFS Lustre Working Group. And this is the organization where people from across the development community for Lustre come together to work out details relating to the Lustre community releases. So we've been operating like this for the best part of a decade now under various names, and we have a hardcore of members who join regularly to our bi-weekly meetings, and then a few people who just drop in once in a while to listen in. We do have some modest participation from Europe. We do have Olaf Weber of HPE regularly joins, and also Jacques Charles from CA joins in sometimes. I would like to encourage you to at least get involved subscribing on the mailing lists or following on the wiki, so your voices are heard as well. One of the things that we've done over the years is the community survey, which goes out in sort of early in the year every year, and we've been doing that for I think maybe 8 years or so. And the last one was done in March of this year, the results, and I did talk about these more extensively at LUG this year. So I won't go into the full details here, but I am just picking out a couple of the results which I think are still interesting. So of course, this data is now sort of 6 months old, so things won't have stood still, but it's an interesting snapshot and interesting for comparison purposes over time. So these are percentage data, so even though the sample population is slightly different from year to year, you can kind of get a sense of trends. On your left, the blue data is last year's data, and on the right, the red is this year's data. So you see overall the trend is across the releases for the older releases to drop down from last year to this year, and the anomaly of that is the Lustre 210 release, which increased markedly. So for me, what we're seeing here is a coalescing around the LTS releases as people, either older systems are coming out of service, new systems being deployed, people upgrading. We're seeing a coalescing there around those. So at the time this survey was taken, the 2.12 release had only just come out. We had announced ahead of time that was going to be the next LTS release, so I know a lot of people were looking at that. There's not strong adoption at this point, but I expect we'll see a very strong uptick in the 2020 survey. And so just to sort of reinforce, when you do see these reminders about this survey going around on the mailing list, the survey only takes a few minutes to complete. We're just looking for sort of high-level data. It does inform our decision-making around the releases. And honestly, if there's no risk whatsoever that you'll get spam or anything else, unwelcome side effects from taking a few minutes to respond. One of the other things that's interesting is to look at, we put a lot of work into new features in Lustre, and sometimes it's hard for us to know if people are using these features, and if they're not, why not? So this is one of the questions that we've had year over year to see, how much people are adopting these new features. And the sort of trend for me that came out very strongly out of this was, we've seen gradually over the last few years a lot more people going to having at least, indicating they have at least one ZFS file system in production, or that they plan to soon. And another indicator here is, project quotas, which is a feature which has been out on LDISC-FS since 2.10. The capability within Lustre is there to run that on ZFS, but it's reliant on the newer ZFS 0.8 release having the necessary hooks and the newer kernel. So it's because you're not having a patch kernel for your ZFS releases. So that's why you're still seeing people indicating that they want to be using it in the next year rather than they're already using it with that feature. And The other thing that's been kind of interesting, we've only really done this finer granularity around the usage for people who are running Lustre. And we have been, one of the things that came out that was a bit surprising to us at the time when we first started doing this a couple of years ago was the number of people using Lustre in AI. Now, as time's gone on, that's, we really understand a lot more about that. And if anything, I think that this data, although it shows a very healthy, number using AI, what we're seeing is a lot of respondents are, checking multiple options, and so AI is often checked with other things as well. And I think even, the population of people who are answering this question is more from being promoted on the Lustre mailing list, and I think that really does, tilt things towards more of a HPC users, because I think when I'm talking to AI customers, they're typically not as aware or engaged with, the community in the same way as the sort of more established sort of HPC Lustre community are. So, I actually think that there's even stronger growth that's not reflected in this data. Oh, and I will say that if you are interested in looking at that data, I saw a couple people taking photos. The full analysis and all the questions is on the OpenSFS wiki under the Lustre Working Group page. So one of the other things we've been talking about over the summer is how we should be more clear about our policy with different Linux kernels. So it is a perennial, and in fact I was just asked questions about this just as we had coffee before we started. There's often like a bit of uncertainty about what Linux distributions, what the state is, can they use them? And I think part of this is the, supports, an overloaded term perhaps, and when people ask the question, do you support this? They might have a different thing in their mind than the person answering. So, sometimes it could be like, do you support it in terms of, do people offer this as a commercial support offering? It may just mean, does it work? So, generally with Linux kernels, there's basically a subset of them that get very, regular attention, that the ones that are focused on for commercial offerings. And then there's a much larger pool of things that maybe get less regular attention. Most, do seem to work, but maybe you can't place the same degree of confidence behind them just because they're not getting the regular scrutiny to the same level. So I think this is we had a bit of discussion around this, and we came to the idea that the best thing was to, go for as broad adoption as we could, and still, encourage where people wanted to, work with some other, Debian or something else that's, we use less often, to allow that in tree, but just to sort of make sure it was more clearly flagged so people understood the distinction between the different options. And so that's basically what we've gone to, and we've when 2.13 comes out, the changelog will reflect that, and there is, like a brief write-up on that on the Lustre wiki, Lustre.org wiki. Another thing as well, I wanted to, a few people have spoken to me since we announced the change, that we would be making a change from Lustre 2.10 to Lustre 2.12 at Supercomputing last year. We had about 6 months or more of discussion around what was the right timing. When we first announced 2.10 as being an LTS release, we said, well, we don't know when the next switch will be. We'll wait and see till the time is right, but it will be at least 18 months. And then it ended up being about 2 years. So some people have maybe weren't aware of those discussions, and at the time we were having the discussions, there was everyone seemed quite comfortable with that switch, and the rationale was there was so much reformatting in the code and change as a result of the efforts to get Lustre into the Linux kernel, that supporting on the older 2.10 releases the newer kernel was becoming really so many things would have to be backported. It was almost not becoming the long-term stable criteria that was required. So we decided we would switch to reset on 2.12. That also gave us some new features, particularly the data on MDT for small file I/O that a lot of people were asking about. And but obviously keeping up the same degree of focus is fairly costly. So we said we would be gradually over the course of this year switching our focus to 2.12. So some people have been a little dismayed about that, but I want to just sort of take a step back here and just so people are aware of this transition, but also perhaps to allay some concerns here. So because of the license we're deployed in, the way we operate, there are really a number of options open to people here. And so just because the focus of the development groups who are working on Lustre is on these different releases, you're under no obligation to have to do anything, any particular course of action. So we have had some sites who have moved from 2.10 to 2.12, and early feedback we've had is that things have gone pretty smoothly for the most part. There have been some, as you'd expect, some edge cases have come out as people are using some new features, and we're working through those and fixing them in the newer versions as we release updates. Some sites, the drive for the newer kernels often is more on the clients than on the server side, so people are able to leverage our interop support and maybe just use, say, a 2.12.2 client with their 2.10x servers, and that's less of less of a risk around the upgrade, or less, they can do that more gradually over time, just adding 2.12 clients where they're needed, and still keeping maybe a mix of 2.10 for the majority of their clients. Of course, there's people who do have formal support arrangements in place, and then they work with their vendor, and the vendor may still offer updates long term. I mean, speaking with my day job, WAM Cloud, working with partners, we still have customers, active support customers who are running Lustre 1.8 releases. So there's, I have no doubt that we'll be running Lustre 2.10 supported customers for many, many years to come, because it's very well adopted release, and there'll be some sites like to stay up to date with the latest and greatest releases, and others are prefer to just leave things well alone and not make changes if it's if there are no major drivers to do so. And so again, there's no planned release anytime soon. I'm sure it's still some way off. I would imagine the next time we do switch, it will be to a release which has a distro with a newer kernel on the servers as a support. That's the only thing I can think of that would be a major tipping point. And even the exact timing around that, it wouldn't necessarily be the first such release either. So we'll definitely make sure that we poll the community, and signal long ahead of time before we make another switch. So getting into specifics, Lustre 2.12.3, it will be the next LTS release coming out, and it's going to be quite an action-packed release thanks to various third-party software releases coming out recently. So Red Hat 7.7 just came out, and so we'll have support for servers and clients for Red Hat 7.7. And when I say Red Hat, I also mean CentOS, Scientific Linux, any other Red Hat derivative. We also expect to have Red Hat 8 client support. And of course, there'll be ongoing, bug fixes as usual as we get more and more feedback as people are upgrading and using the newer features. And then late-breaking MoFed 4.7 is apparently due out before the end of the month, and so we will look to, verify that things work smoothly with that. Definitely with MoFed 4.6, we found that we did need a slight change to be able to build successfully with that, so we'll definitely make sure we validated that before we issue the GA version of 2.12.3. So 2.13 is the major release we're working on. Things are definitely converging now, and the way things are looking right now, we've got maybe 18, 19 issues that are still in scope to be fixed for the release, and I think only about 4 don't actually have a patch in flight already. We're definitely converging to a point where we'll go into a code freeze and begin the really intensive release testing here. One thing to note, I say here, we're still, at the moment, we're building with default by ZFS 0713. We had early this summer switched to experiment with ZFS 081, and we found that there were a number of our ZFS D&E tests that started failing at a much higher level than had previously, so we have rolled back to 0713. It is still possible, like we need to do a bit more investigation about the 081. Certainly it's possible to build and run with that release, but before we make it a default version, we'd want to ensure that it definitely is working well. Looking at some early contribution data for this release, so this is courtesy of my colleague Dustin Leverman of Oak Ridge. So I think probably, focusing on European contributors here, regulars of GSI, Atos, and CA, and then we've had some new first-time contributors for this release cycle. So I think it's DESI, as far as I recall, they're a German particle research company, and InBase, who are a Russian storage vendor, have had a contribution so far in this release. This was as of the last tag, so the date's a little bit different, and probably the final, the final release numbers will be a bit bigger by the end, of course. So this is showing how the data so far compares to past releases. So if you look at the total number of commits, which is the second column in, and you see like the really big releases were 2.4 and 2.8, which had the big, D&E phase 1 and phase 2. So there was, an awful lot of change in those, and you'll see that it's fairly, above average so far. In terms of the number of commits, probably the largest factor is there's still a lot of changes going in, which are just very small changes driven by the Linux kernel work. But if you look at the number of lines of code, it's much, much lower than the relative, number of commits. You see it's a number of very small changes going in rather than, don't take that number of commits as an indicator of risk, is I guess what I'm trying to say. Number of developers is still fairly comfortable. It seems like, we have a large group of people who spend all their time working Rust development, and there's a smaller number of, a larger number of people who just maybe make, a small change once in a while. And then, of course, the statistic I always really like to look at is, comparing the number of organizations from the very top entry for Lustre 1.8 back at Oracle with, our current situation, where you just see we definitely do have, a big development community now. So here's the latest Lustre.org roadmap. So Andreas, I think, is talking tomorrow, and we'll go into a lot more detail about some of the, these things, and also generally we just keep the sort of marquee items on this graphical roadmap to stop it being cluttered. But our way of operating is we have a lot of, we try do development of things of many things which are on this projects page. You can just see the link down the bottom, perhaps, and those all get merged in as things become ready, and we operate to a sort of we have instead of a fixed release set of features for a given release, we do it sort of time-based, so things cut off. If they're ready by a certain time, they get integrated. Otherwise, they, get pushed out to a later release. And so the current way things are trending with 2.13, we'd expect to have a 2.14 release in the middle of next year, and probably very early in 2021 for a 2.15. So we have just started talking about that recently in LWG 2.15 release. So I mentioned a couple of times about Lustre in the Linux kernel. So it's Neil Brown of SUSE and James Simmons of Oak Ridge are really, the ones doing much of the work here. And this has been a different approach to how this was done in recent years, where it's basically taken outside an independent thing that Neil is hosting, an independent Git repository, and they're able to make changes much more rapidly and get things working. And so the intention is to, I think they're sort of getting caught up with, because of course it's a moving target as Lustre moves on, so they are fairly close to getting caught up. I think they got up to the 2.11 level, and their intention is to really get to a sort of 2.12 level and have that be what gets accepted into a hopefully directly into the Linux mainline. And then, so we will have an issue here. This will become an interesting support dynamic, because we'll need to make sure, think about how we handle that with our, how we fold that into our testing for releases. That will be another option that people could be using. And of course, we'll still need to keep our own native clients until such a time that people are only using Linux distributions that are based on whatever kernel that ends up being in the mainline. So we are going to have a fairly lengthy transition period there. Oh, and I was going to say as well, and the other thing that there's been some recent activity on that's very useful for people who are using LDiskFS is we have had a number of the 2FS procs patches accepted upstream, which we have a pretty small delta now, and it's much easier for us to keep up to date with the new releases as they come out. Lustre in the cloud, there was, been some interesting announcements recently with Amazon's release last year. They gave a presentation at LUG. We've had, Cray and Intel had cloud offerings out in the past, and even one of the things from the contribution stats earlier, you may not have noticed that both Amazon and AliCloud, who are basically like the Chinese equivalent of Amazon, had contributions in the 2.13 release. So it is from usage in those areas, the broader Lustre community are getting some feedback as well. Wanted just to touch briefly on IML. So this, used to be the Intel proprietary management and monitoring tool. It got open sourced a couple of years ago. This is still very much an active project at the WAM Cloud division at DDN, and the 5.0 release came out in May, and the 5.1 release is in, this is an older version of my slides. Oh well. The 5.1 version is in release candidates in testing right now. Release documentation, always give a plug for this. So this is the easiest thing if you're ever using some documentation and you find it's either inadequate or wrong, even if you're not sure what the correct version should be, if you just open a ticket to let us know, that helps us, improve the quality and hopefully spare somebody else some frustration. And then, I was kind of tickled by this picture. Someone forwarded it to me. This was a competing technology was circulating this to potential customers, this upper one, Lustre developers at launch. And I think the implication is meant to be that maybe we're a little, behind the times or something. But to me, I think quite the opposite. I think the fact that Lustre's been around a long time is one of our, big assets, because, these are not easy problems to solve, and it's one thing to just have, hero benchmarks on some POC, but it's another thing to be running in mission critical systems for a number of years at the really, the volume that we have to face. And so, I think that's why we are seeing people in the AI space, turn to established technologies like Lustre as a way of solving their problems with dealing with large amounts of data. And so, sorry? And we are snappy dressers. So, and then I did want to plug, this was a talk Andreas gave at ISC, at an event just after ISC, because Lustre just has celebrated the 20th anniversary of its first commit. And so Andreas, was asked to give a talk and put together this fantastic talk. So please, go have a look at that talk. It's very entertaining and does have some, reflections across over the time. So it's kind of entertaining, but also informative as well. And then, so just to summarize, LTS model seems to be going well. That data suggests that people are coalescing around those releases 2.13 release is coming soon. 2.12.3 is coming even sooner, and IML 5.1 is coming even sooner still. Another plug for the Lustre Working Group. There's Earl, if you want to get connected and find out a bit more about what we get up to. So, any questions? Yeah, it's true, and
appreciate you showing it up here.
Yeah, and the other thing to note is there's a really big chunk of other, and that's actually just people. That's people who just work for random companies who make contributions or fixes that end up into Lustre, but they did so by landing it to the Linux kernel. So we do get some feedback from that route as well. It's just that we segregate it because they're not consciously. They're contributing to Linux, not Lustre necessarily, right? Sam?
Hi. Do I understand correctly that LTS switch decision affects next 2.10 release? So there are high probability there is no 2.10 releases anymore.
Yeah, I said after Lustre 2.10.7 that I didn't expect there to be another release, and then we did 2.10.8 like 2 weeks later. So we have no plans to do it. It's definitely the expectation would be that from a bug fix point of view, a lot of things have shaken out. There's still going to be some issues people might face, edge cases. It will be, that's the nice thing with it being open source. It's very easy for people to, if they want to have a slight change, to apply that change themselves and roll their own if they have a special need. But the thing that will be getting much of the testing focus and the community focus will be the 2.12 releases.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Let me come back to one of the first slides you've shown, the market where Lustre is present. It's quite interesting to see that overwhelming acceptance in education and very, very low acceptance, at least based on that slide, and media entertainment and in financial services. Any reason for that? And what, financial services, what are they using? Is this GPF territory?
That's the thing. It's very hard to know with an open source software. People can use the software without having to let the people who make it know about it. So I do know from my day job that there's a lot of financial service companies who do use Lustre, but they're using it, to them, they're not using it, they're using a solution. And so I think the issue, this is just like the comment I made with AI, I think the issue is the people who are representing those companies are not on Lustre Discuss. They don't see this survey, and if they give their feedback to their vendor, right?
The question about kernel version. So you said that we decided that developers can send patches for primary distros, and customers who are interested in other distros need to port them to these distros. So question is, are you going to exclude some distros from changelog in next Lustre version?
No, we're just going to mark them as to which ones are getting the focus testing and which ones are not, that are more sort of community driven.
So what are these primary distros now? Red Hat?
Yeah, so like the slide I put up, let's see. So here, I put up what the releases, the distros that we were focusing on for a given release. This is what we would discuss in the Lustre working group, where we're going to focus that attention. And so every release would have a page like that they're recorded, and that's what goes out and is promoted. But, you know, like I say, I know that much wider range of options than that is, you know, is possible to use and works well.
Last question. My question is regarding putting back the client back to the Linux kernel. What is the real value of that move? Because it was pulled out last year from the Linux kernel.
Right.
So what will change to keep it in the Linux kernel?
So I think the biggest change is that we have a clear person who's driving that initiative, who is, you know, one of the Linux.org, you know, established maintainers, right? So Neil Brown was the maintainer for NFS for some years. He knows personally Linus and, you know, Alviro and all those people whose decision it would be. So when it was in the staging area, we were in this situation, and it was put forward to the staging area by somebody who made all these assurances as an individual and then switched jobs and didn't answer any emails. So it was straight away set off on the wrong foot with the community, and we were working with people who didn't have a file system background, and having to justify making every single change one at a time was a very frustrating experience on both sides. So what happened was it's removed from staging, but it's coming in again. And so when Neil will assert that it's ready, he'll do it directly to Linus, and it will be a question of it going directly into the main line. It won't go in via staging, it will just go directly in at that time. So I agree, it would be, if it's there would be some real value to that. It would definitely, you know, from an administration point of view, be easier, but it's, you know, it's hard to put an exact timing on something that's not a clear-cut technical issue. It's more of a political issue, and then even when that happens, there will be some time till it becomes, you know, very, you know, useful when it's accepted by major distros. So, does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. And just to say as well, I'm happy to chat on breaks. Just do come and if you have any questions. So.
Thank you again, Peter.
Okay.